the repo that I built onto Slack. If you want to download it, you're welcome to follow along. If you don't, it's totally fine as well. So a lot of you have been struggling with the Rails Association Labs and Form Labs and that sort of thing. As I said earlier, forms are kind of a nightmare, and they're kind of what you're going to spend a lot of your time doing. And Rails has a ton of helpers that will help us do that stuff. I still find the helpers to be kind of a nightmare, and the documentation pretty difficult to understand. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take like raw HTML, a raw HTML form, and then slowly convert it through, like, I have a whole bunch of Git branches that take you through using a bunch of the different helpers. Because a lot of the helpers are actually like combination helpers and meant to be used with one another. But it's kind of hard to get a sense of what's the HTML that they actually produce and what are they expecting and that sort of thing. So hopefully this will clear up at least like one line of inquiry as far as like form helpers and stuff like that. There's still a whole ton of them. Like, I can't really like go over all of them, but hopefully this will give you a sense of like how to actually figure out what any of them do and when to use them and that sort of thing. All right, so I'm just gonna pop this open. Oops, I'm on the wrong branch. So I'm on the Node City ID branch. So this is the first commit. I'm gonna pop open my server. And basically all this does is allows me to create a new person and then search for that person. No route. Sorry, people. So I can go to people new just to review what we talked about this morning. The reason I can go to people new is because I have a route. So I just did resources people, right, which auto-generates 8 routes for me, including people new. I have a people controller. So I have the new action defined. I have a form in the new action, which you should take a look at, which is app views people new. So here's my form. So it's just raw HTML, right? This is what we would do in Sinatra. And I have a person table in the database. I think people in this database just have fantastic. Do not have a person model. Person. So people in my database just have a name and a city ID. So I want to be able to create a person through a form, and I want to be able to say a person is associated with a particular city. So like super basic. And then I would like to be able to search for that person in another form. So if I look at my routes, I can find out the other thing I can do. So if I send a GET request to the root route, I go to my search controller to the root action. Or if I send a GET request to /search, I get the search controller and the search action. So let's go to the root route. So all this is a super basic form. Again, if you want to look at the HTML for it, you can either pop open the inspector, or you can come into search root, and you can see this form. So there's 2 different ways that we can build forms. Rails gives us form tag and form for. So again, this is just Ruby code. I'm using embedded Ruby, ERB, to evaluate Ruby code, the goal of which is to produce HTML. So at the end of the day, if anything is broken, it's not working, you're not getting the right stuff coming through, into the controller, that sort of thing. This is the place to go. And then more importantly, this is the place to go, to actually look at the HTML that your Ruby is generating. A lot of people, including myself in the past, have gotten like super focused on this and making sure like the Ruby looks right. But at the end of the day, if the Ruby's not producing the right HTML, it doesn't really matter. And sometimes I get so frustrated, I'll just write straight HTML because I'm like, I know what the HTML is that will work, and these things that are helping me, these helpers and form helpers and that sort of thing, are so confusing that it's taking me longer to use the helper than to just write the raw HTML. So we can look up form tag and find out what it does. Nope. I find this documentation to be super confusing for a couple reasons that I'll explain as we go along. So basically what this is saying is this is the signature of the method, right? So this is a Ruby method, and here are the options that I can pass to it. So it takes 3 arguments. I can give it a hash as the first option. I can give it a hash as the second option, and I can also pass it a block. I don't find this usually to be that helpful. Typically what I do is I look at the actual examples and then just copy one of the examples and sort of translate it to what I'm trying to do. What's that? Yeah, I just find they don't really explain very well what the actual arguments are, and when you see them, to me it becomes super obvious. But if you ever need like the actual reference documentation, like you're like, what options can I pass in the hash, right? It tells you right here. Here are the keys you can pass, and you can guess at what the values are, or you can come just down to these examples and see what's an example of something that I could actually pass to this method. Form tag, and then it'll also show you here's the HTML that this Ruby code will produce, which is again all we care about. So all I'm doing is I'm taking this super common one. The first argument is where is the form going to post, and then the second argument is what is the action of the form. I've said this a million times. These are really the only 2 things we care about in a form, right? So what this is going to do, this form tag is going to generate a form tag with an action of /search and a method of get. Right. So if we look at my HTML, that's what we get, right? An action of /search and a method of get. So this form is not going to post. It's just going to send a get request, and then it's going to search my database, and then I have like some inputs in here that again get generated by these helpers. So rather than writing like a raw HTML label, I can write label tag. It takes 2 arguments. The ID of the thing and the thing that's actually going to print out on the screen. A text field tag, right, is going to generate an input tag for me with this as the name attribute, and then this is going to make me a submit tag. And all of this stuff is in this form helper documentation here. All of these methods are linked up here. So anytime you want to generate some HTML, just use these little Ruby helpers and look at the examples and then more or less copy paste. Your life should be easier. But remember, at the end of the day, all we care about is the HTML. Okay, so what are you looking for? I'm going to put in some name. And what's going to happen when I hit Save Changes? It's what? How do you know?
Just looks like it's going to go to the search. Search.
Yeah, so all we know is it's going to go to /search, right? It's going to send a get request to /search. So the next thing we have to do is say, okay, where does /search take us? So if we go to our routes, we can see the map. So the sort of trail of breadcrumbs of each request is what's the route, what's the controller, what's the view. So I know where this form is going to submit. It's going to send a get request to /search. And then this tells me what is going to handle that route. So I'm going to go to the search controller and the search action. So now I can look up my search controller and my search action. And as Javon guessed, I'm submitting this name parameter, and I'm just doing find by name in my database. I'm either finding a person or I'm just generating a person object with the default name of default person. Everyone with me? Cool.
No, can you do that again?
Yeah. All right, so we'll start from here. So when I go to the root route, where does it take me? I can go to my routes file, and a GET request to the root route is going to go to the search controller and to the root action. So if I go to the search controller and I look at the root action is not doing anything special. By default, Rails is always going to render the view with the same name as the action. So I'm going to go into my search controller's search folder, look for the root view ERB template, and then I'm going to see, okay, what HTML is going to get generated. And all of these are basically Ruby methods provided to me by Rails, these form helpers, and these should help me generate HTML. So this should be the HTML that I'm looking for on this page, and it matches. So then my next question is, what's going to happen when I submit this form? The way I can figure that out is I can look at the action and the method of the form, which will tell me where it's going to submit the form to. And then I can go back into Rails and I can say, okay, who handles a GET request to /search? That's the search controller and the search action. And all of this is arbitrary. None of this is RESTful. I'm intentionally just sort of making stuff up just so we can sort of like follow these breadcrumbs. So I come over to my search controller and to my search action, and I can see what the search controller is doing is it's pulling the parameter of name out of my form, which comes from right here, right, which came from originally this text field tag, which generated an input with the name attribute of name. And all I'm doing is I'm looking in the database for that person's name that got passed through. If I find it, I put it into this instance variable. If I don't find it, I just create a default in-memory person. And then again, Rails will always render the template of the same name of the action. So I'm going to go to the search view, and all I'm doing is I'm just printing out the person's name that I found in the database. So if I look for Blake, I should get Blake here. If I look for something that doesn't exist, I should get default person in my view. Cool. So the point of this was to show you, like, I'm using the most basic Rails helpers, mainly just raw HTML. So now I'm going to swap out some of that HTML.
Just very quickly, go back to your search.
Search controller.
No. Well, I guess it doesn't really matter. So when you submit the search, traditionally, or it felt like when we were using Sinatra before, it would be like a post request. But if here you're using it, you're still putting it as a search, as a GET request. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So sorry. Say that again.
So like with Sinatra, when we would submit a form, it would be like a post. Here you're using a GET for that. I'm just curious.
So why am I using a GET? So if you go to Google and you submit a form, they do a GET request. And the reason that they do a GET request is post semantically implies that we're changing something on the database side. So if you're just searching, it's really just kind of a request for information. You're not creating any new records on the database side. So any form that we expect to create something new on the database side should post. Any form that's just retrieving information should be a GET. But most forms happen to be stuff where we're like creating new stuff on the database side, so most forms post. Other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I had a lot of trouble setting the root view of my app to just /
Mm-hmm.
I ended up having to use a helper called roots2, but could you explain how that works?
Sure. So the nice thing about this is most of this stuff there's like commented out code. So there's just, this is how you set the root route. You just uncomment this, and now the root route points to the welcome controller and the index action.
I mean, that implies that I have a welcome controller.
It does. So if you change this to something else, like search, now it's the search controller.
Cool.
Good question though. What I did was I just said a get request to slash is the same thing as saying the root route. So I'm being more literal rather than using this like helper thing. You can do it either way.
Does the pound symbol have any special meaning?
Yes and no. Basically, like this is a little Railsism for this thing on the left is controller, this thing is action, but there's no like Ruby meaning. It's just like a Rails convention. Other questions? These are great questions. Okay, so this is like the absolute simplest way we could do this with the least amount of help from Rails. What did I change? Oh, right. All right, so I'm going to go, the next step is to manual city ID. And now, what did I change in here? Yeah, so now I changed my new person view. So before, I didn't have the ability to set a city ID along with a person. I was just creating the person. Now I want to be able to say, what city does this person come from? So if I reload this, people new, I'm going to get a form, and it's going to have a drop-down box. So this is like a pretty common thing that people are going to want. The ability to have like sort of dynamically populated select boxes. And how are those things populated? How does this look in Ruby and in HTML? All you need in HTML is this select tag. So you have the select tag, and then inside you have a bunch of option tags. And the way this works is this is kind of going to be the parameter that gets sent through. Just like on an input box, right? You have the name attribute, and you can nest like something inside, like a person attribute or a person key. And then you have like three options, right, that somebody's selecting from in the box. The thing in the middle, right, in between the tags is going to be the thing people visually see. The thing that has a value is going to be the thing that actually gets passed through as a parameter. So you typically don't want to pass through strings as parameters. You want to pass through numbers, and typically those numbers refer to IDs in your database, right? So probably in my database, I'm imagining I have a city object with ID 1, which is New York City, Boston, Chicago, Gil.
I remember one time I was looking at the live review on forms, and she referenced value for params, and couldn't get anything working until she started deleting it instead. So why do we use value here on the keys, on your option?
It's hard for me to know the specific case that you're talking about.
Yeah, like, I don't know, value, it just, all it did was like, put, I guess it's weird because this is not a search box, this is like a drop down thing, so maybe.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is this is how you do it when you're trying to do a select box. The value thing is the thing that's actually going to get passed through as a parameter, and this is like what you're going to see visually, and then this will be the key for the thing that gets sent through. So in the parameters, in the controller, we're going to have basically post as the top level key, then we're going to have that point to a hash with name and whatever somebody puts in, and then city ID, and then whatever somebody selects from here, whatever is the value of that thing will get put into city ID, and that comes from here.
So it saves as city ID, and then somewhere city ID is with the actual city name.
Yeah, so
You could even do like, instead of New York City, you could do ERB and pull the city ID.
yeah, so that's where we're going. This is hard coded. This doesn't make any sense, right? Like we should be pulling this stuff out of the database. So this is like just the raw HTML. I'm not using any Ruby, nothing dynamic. And then we're going to swap this for something a little bit more dynamic. All right, so what do I have next? Now I have misspelled dynamic city ID. Make sure you misspell it properly. All right, so as Alex just pointed out, like I kind of hard-coded this. It doesn't make any sense, right? I really should be pulling these IDs and values out of the database. And luckily I have ERB, so I can go to the database and just ask it, what are all the cities, right? So this way, if I add more cities to the database, or I like forget what a city's name is, I don't need to know, right? That's the whole point of ERB. It's the whole point of dynamic web apps. So I just call city.all.each, right? Each thing is going to be a city active record object, and I'm just building HTML with ERB, right? So I'm interpolating the ID of the city as the value. I'm interpolating the name of the city as the thing that's going to be displayed, and then just have an end. And obviously, like I'm not printing out the return of the each block, just the stuff in the options. So just to prove to you that that will give me the exact same HTML, let's reload this, and we should get a form with a select box with more or less the exact same thing, but with just like slightly different IDs. But these are the real IDs in the database. And we still get the same drop-down box.
That like keeps it safer too, because that value definitely corresponds to that city.
To the right, yeah.
It's 100%.
100%. All right, is everybody with me?
Do you remember you mentioned someone could like inject information into your database?
Mm-hmm.
What precautions do you make when you
So the fear is that somebody is going to change the form and add additional inputs. With something like a city or a person, I'm not really that worried. Oh no, I take it back. So if I am creating people here, if people are like users in my system, I might be worried that like somebody's going to add like an admin field here and say like admin true. So that's what we were saying. That's what the strong parameters protect us from. So Active Record no longer allows you to just say params person. It forces you to say person params and call this method and then do this like require step and this permit step. So I'm very explicitly saying you must have at least a top level key of person in the parameters that come through, and you're only allowed to have this lower level key of name and city ID. So if you pass through additionally admin equals true or something like that, Active Record will reject it and say like forbidden attribute or something like that. Other questions? No? All right, cool. So what can we do next? Options for select, hard-coded. All right, so now we get this super long thing. And this is like, as we kind of go through this, this is not like something that I would normally do, but this is just to show you kind of like the different helpers and how they sort of work together. So the goal always is to produce the same output, all of these steps that I'm taking. So again, I've kind of gone back to hard coding something to show you sort of what the syntax of what options for select is looking for. So when you think about what we're trying to produce is this combination of values and things that get displayed on the screen. So I need to have like essentially like an array of arrays, right, of these like key value pairs of the ID of the thing in the database and then its name. So I just hard coded Boston 1, New York City 2, Chicago 3. So in theory, this would be the ID of the city in the database, and that's what options for select is looking for, this array of arrays. It doesn't really make sense ever to use options for select like this with it just kind of hard coded. So let's skip this one. But this would still give us like a valid result.
But that would be helpful if you had that array of arrays and you just put in like
yeah, totally. So yeah, typically how you would use it is you dynamically generate the array of arrays.
it'd be like a very like
You're going to see exactly what it would be like. So right, as Alex is pointing out, we could dynamically generate that array of arrays, and that's what I'm doing here, kind of in 2 steps. You'd probably do it all in 1 step, but just so like people can see what's going on. I'm just mapping over all the cities, and as I map over, I'm generating this array of the name of the city along with its ID. So before you could see, I just hard-coded this array of arrays of the name of the city and the ID, and here I'm dynamically generating that array of arrays and then giving options for select that array of arrays. So now we kind of have 3 steps, right? We make the array of arrays that options for select needs. We pass it to options for select, and then options for select is responsible for generating this HTML for us. So hopefully we still keep getting the exact same HTML. It looks like this is kind of screwed up. Oh, that's because that should not be printed. So again, we have this same select tag, right? I haven't changed the select tag, and all I want it to do is produce 3 options with the value corresponding to the name of the thing. Are people with me? Going kind of fast, so let me know if I'm going too fast. Happy to slow down. Yeah, so this is the actual city model. So I'm talking directly to the database, calling the all method on it, which is going to give me back an array of all the city objects that I'm calling map to produce that array output that I had before.
First, just remember to repeat those questions because I have no idea what you said.
Oh.
And then I think I understood from your explanation. Second is like option for select. It also outputs the HTML. Like go to the browser. Like the. So this is specifically for a dropdown.
Mm-hmm.
So option for select is a helper for dropdown.
Yep, so it's a helper for the select tag. So it would always be nested inside the select tag, which produces that drop-down box.
Yes.
So these are all like pre-hyper specific. That's kind of what I'm pointing at is like I find them very difficult to remember because they're so specific for the case you use them for and what are the arguments you have to pass to them.
Sort of feels like they are for like an ERB HTML file, like its own like methods
Mm-hmm.
with its own like requirements, and you pass it in those requirements, and you could expect it to do a certain thing.
Yep, I would say that's a very good description. All right, cool. So we kind of went from a hard-coded options for select to a dynamic one. Now this is more like what you would actually use. All right, so again, I still have the select tag. Now I'm using a new helper that's called options from collection for select. Like these get really nuts. So this is like this hyper-specific case of I'm trying to give a set of HTML options to a select tag, and I want to populate it with a collection. So I'm generating options from a collection for a select tag. So the API for this one is like a lot cleaner, right? Like all I do is I just say, here's the collection. The collection is all of the cities in my database. And then what gets tricky is then you're like, well, what's ID and name, right? So what I end up doing is like, what is it, options for? Options from collection for select. Not at the top. This one's not even listed here. Options from collection. I don't know why that's not on. Doesn't have its own entry for whatever reason, but. So this is the actual documentation. So it tells us the first argument is the collection, then it tells us we have the value method, and then it tells us we have the text method. So if you know kind of what the HTML is that you're trying to produce, these things will make a lot more sense. So value method, right, when we originally wrote it with HTML, our whole point was we needed to produce a value with like an ID, right? And then we needed to produce a text field in that option menu. So like when we were in here, right, we had this value and then we had this text. So that's what they're referring to when they say value method and text method. So what they're saying is, what I'm going to do is you give me a symbol, and for each element in the collection, I'm going to call that method on it, and that will be the thing that I put as the value right here. So I'm going to iterate through all of the cities. For each city, I'm going to call its ID method, and that's what I will put as the value of this option. Then I'm going to iterate, well, not then. As I iterate through each city, I'm going to call its ID method, and the second method I'll call is its name method, and I'll put whatever the name method returns as like the thing that gets visually displayed. So again, like we built all this ourselves before. Remember, I had an array, and I like mapped over the array, and I called like each element.id and each element.name in my array. So I manually built that array, and all Rails is saying is like, listen, like I know how to do that, right? I can write Ruby too. Why make you do that? Just tell me the method you want to call on the first thing, the first element in that double array, and tell me the method you want to call on the second thing. So most of the time when you're using these like super complicated helpers, you'll have some collection that you're passing to it, and then you'll have like a bunch of different methods that they ask you to give as symbols that they'll call on whatever object it's iterating through, and then that will help it generate HTML. So typically it's like a method that it's calling on the object. So if you don't have like that attribute in the database, it's probably not going to work, and you're probably like slightly misunderstanding what they're asking for. And if you know the HTML that you want to generate, like if you look at the documentation and you see what they're saying this will spit out, this will give you more idea what's going on, right? So right here, they're showing you, I'm calling ID when you put ID here on the person object, right? I'm calling name on the person name here, and that's actually where we're going to put that in the HTML. So looking at the examples and what the actual HTML is that gets spit out will help you a lot trying to figure out what do I put where in these like long string of arguments that these things require. Alex.
In your code, you did like people.all to get the list of all the cities, or city.all.
Yes.
Could you just do city? Like that's kind of what they have. They just have the object people.
Maybe. Let's see.
They pass that.
Oh, that might be an instance where
Because it had
yeah.
Yeah, so if you want it in the controller, right, you could call city.all, set it at cities, and then I could say like that. So just to be clear, I'm in new, so if I wanted, I could pass at cities, and I could say city.all, because instance variables are available in any view, and then here I can just refer to an object if that like makes more sense to people. To me, that's an extra step, kind of like that is not really giving me any benefit. But good, yeah, great question. Okay, so then we have collection select, which is like an even more truncated version of this. So what we're doing here is we're actually like merging the select box with its options. So before you had a select tag, right? And then I was just dynamically generating options for it. Now I'm saying, hey, this is such a common thing that I want to do. Why don't I make the select box and the options for it dynamically in one line? So the first thing that it wants to know is like, what's the object that's kind of like the top level object that this select box is like kind of belonging to, right? City and people are related, and person is kind of like the top level object that we've been talking about, right? Before I had a select tag that was like person and then in brackets city ID. So that's basically what I'm building here. These first two arguments, it's like what's the object, what's the top level key, and then what's going to be like the first level key that these things are going to produce for us. So basically, like all we had before was I was manually doing the select tag with these two things, and options from collection for select had these arguments, and then we put it all together, and our goal is still, again, to generate the exact same HTML. So now we have a form, right? We have a select tag, still the exact same person, city ID thing here, same values, everything is still staying the same. Cool?
Can you just switch back?
Yeah, we can go back one commit.
Or no, I mean, read it from like this and then the browser. person, city ID, and then
So the person and city ID, that's like in place of the select tags that we have.
Yeah, so we go back and just really quick look at what we had. Right, so I had manually written person city ID in the select tag before, right, and now it's dynamically generating that. Other questions? On board? Okay.
it looks pretty.
What's that?
It looks so much better.
Yeah, it's great. When you figure out how they actually work, it's so nice. All right. All I did here was I replaced all the HTML that I had before that was generating the form with all helpers, right? So now I'm using pure Ruby here, right? All of this is still generating the exact same HTML. But I did not write a line of HTML, right? I just used Ruby to dynamically generate HTML. Okay, last one. Now we'll use form 4. So the big change here is this block variable. So this is something that used to confuse the heck out of me. If you look up like form helpers, you'll get this page. So this is the top result, other than like the Rails guide. And so what it will say is it will assume that you're using, let's see, like, that's a good example. So what this documentation is assuming is you'll always see object name at the beginning. So what ends up happening with form 4 is now if I search for, what did I just search for? Rails form. So there's two pieces of documentation that look very similar. There's form builder and form helper. So form builder assumes that you're using form 4 and has all of the exact same helper functions. So here's checkbox, checkbox. So the one that will usually come up most commonly as the #1 result will be exactly the same, right? Everything is the same except it'll have this object name at the beginning. So this is meant to be used without form 4, more with something like form tag. And so what you have to tell it is you have to tell it like which object is this form kind of like bound to? What is this form trying to generate? So if it's like a person form, you'd give it like a person object, and then you do all of the rest of the stuff you'd need to do to generate the HTML. When you use form 4, you can see I've given it the object already. So I'm telling the whole form, everything from here on out is going to be related to a person. And so I want you to nest everything inside of a person. So when you generate your HTML, your input attributes and your name attributes on that HTML always have a top-level person key. So all of these attributes will be like inside of a person object. So for that reason, these methods are all like exactly the same. It's just all of the ones that use form are supposed to be used with form tag ask you to give the object name first, and all of the ones that are used with form 4 skip that first argument because you've already told it everything that happens from here on out is related to a person object. So what ends up happening is you call form 4, it yields this f thing, and this f thing is called a form builder object, and this is the documentation for a form builder object. So as you can see, I'm calling methods on this f object, so that's why you need to look at the documentation for the form builder object, not the form helper object. So the form helper object is just like when you're just using the regular tags, and the form builder object is when you're calling it on this f object. So when you look at what the HTML you get for this is, it should all still be nested under person. even though I didn't have to specify anywhere that it should be nested under person. So you still see person name, you still see person ID, city ID, because all of it is called on F. So now my collection select, before, remember we had like person, city ID, right? Now we got rid of the person because it knows that this is a person that it's related to. So now I just have city ID, and then these were the three things that were from the original like options thing. So this is kind of the part that's related to the select tag, and this is the part that's related to the options. Go.
Oh, where do you specify like the method, get or post?
So let's look. So this form is going to post. So by default, all forms, that's not true. The form builder is like crazy smart, and it will actually like figure out what's the correct method that it should do based on what route you're at. So you can use the same form and render it. If you render it from new versus edit, like it will send like a patch or a post depending on like which route you're at, and or depending on what type of object you pass to it. So I think it actually doesn't do it based on the route. It must do it based on, so if I give it an empty person object, so in my people controller, my new action just gives it a blank person object. So it looks at the blank person object and says, oh, you must be creating a whole new person. We must be on the new route, therefore I must be wanting to post. If you give it a person that you found in the database, right, like if you were on edit would probably look like this. At person equals person dot find params ID, right? And then if you rendered the same form, because you wanted to edit this person and then submit it, if you rendered the same form would be smart enough to submit it as a patch to go to the update action rather than a post to go to the create action.
Would it also be smart enough to add default values to the form?
Yes. That's another awesome thing. So if you bind it to this object, if this object has values, when you call f.label name, it will call the method on that and put it as the value. So Form 4 is really, really awesome, and still kind of like a nightmare and still kind of confusing. So it's like one of those things, as you start building more complicated forms and you have associated objects and all this sorts of stuff, it's always a battle to get it right, because you have to get like these incantations exactly right. I forget them every time I finally figure them out. But when you do, like, I mean, this is pretty fucking genius. Like, we went from all of that static HTML to something that's completely dynamic, can be rendered from various views. It's pretty awesome when you get it working. But I also know that like I've struggled with collection select, trying to figure out like what to do for like an hour and just ended up like writing HTML. But the nice thing is once you get it working, it's pretty dynamic and will like help you out a ton. Whereas if you bail and do it statically, you'll probably have to like repeat a lot of your work. So all of this stuff plays into like the association labs that you guys have just been doing, and hopefully you have this repo. This is on my GitHub. You can like walk through this progression as many times as you want and like get clues as to how to like figure this stuff out. Compare the HTML to the Ruby, compare this to the documentation, and see if you can kind of get your brain working like what's the relationship between all three. What's the Ruby I need to write? How does the documentation describe it? And then what's the HTML that gets produced? And hopefully if you have at least like one set of things that actually work, you should be able to work out all of the other ones, because all the other ones have like very similar sort of semantics to this. Hopefully. I did. But all the code's on GitHub as well. Questions? All right, thanks guys.